Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The Will to Power. We are up to point number 5, the moral ideal, and under this is another subsection entitled A Criticism of Ideals. And then we are up to section, aphorism, whatever you want to call it, 330. It were the thing to begin this criticism in such wise as to do away with the word ideal, a criticism of desiderata. 331. Only the fewest amongst us are aware of what is involved, from the standpoint of desirability, in every thus should it be, but it is not, or even thus it ought to have been. Such expressions of opinion involve a condemnation of the whole course of events. For there is nothing quite isolated in the world. The smallest thing bears the largest on its back. On thy small injustice the whole nature of the future depends. The whole is condemned by every criticism which is directed at the smallest part of it. Now, granting that the moral norm, even as Kant understood it, is never completely fulfilled, and remains like a sort of beyond hanging over reality without ever falling down to it, then morality would contain in itself a judgment concerning the whole, which would still, however, allow of the question, whence does it get the right thereto? How does the part come to acquire this judicial position relative to the whole? And if, as some have declared, this moral condemnation of and dissatisfaction with reality is an ineradicable instinct, is it not possible that this instinct may perhaps belong to the ineradicable stupidities and immodesties of our species? But in saying this, we are doing precisely what we deprecate. The point of view of desirability and of unauthorized fault-finding is part and parcel of the whole character of worldly phenomena, just as every injustice and imperfection is. It is our very notion of perfection, which is never gratified. Every instinct which desires to be indulged gives expression to its dissatisfaction with the present state of things. How? Is the whole perhaps made up of a host of dissatisfied parts, which all have desiderata in their heads? Is the course of things perhaps the road hence, the road leading away from reality, that is to say, eternal dissatisfaction in itself? Is the conception of desiderata perhaps the essential motive power of all things? Is it Deus? It seems to me of the utmost importance that we should rid ourselves of the notion of the whole of an entity and of any kind of power or form of the unconditioned, for we shall never be able to resist the temptation of regarding it as the supreme being, and of christening it God. The all must be subdivided. We must unlearn our respect for it, and reappropriate that which we have lent the unknown and imaginary entity, for the purposes of our neighbor and ourselves. Whereas, for instance, Kant said, quote, "Two things remain forever worthy of our honor," at the close of his Practical Reason. Today we should prefer to say, quote, "Digestion is more worthy of honor." The concept, the all, will always give rise to the old problems. How is evil possible, etc. Therefore, there is no all. There is no great sensorium or inventarium or power magazine. 332. A man as he ought to be. This sounds to me in just as bad taste as a tree as it ought to be. 333. Ethics, or the philosophy of desirability. Things ought to be otherwise. Things ought to become different. Dissatisfaction would thus seem the heart of ethics. One could find a way out of it, first by selecting only those states in which one is free from emotion, secondly by grasping the insolence and stupidity of the attitude of mind, for to desire that something should be otherwise than it is, means to desire that everything should be different. It involves a damaging criticism of the whole, but life itself consists in such desiring. To ascertain what exists, how it exists, seems an ever so much higher and more serious matter than every thus should it be, because the latter, as a piece of human criticism and arrogance, appears to be condemned as ludicrous from the start. It expresses a need which would fain have the organization of the world correspond with our human well-being, and which directs the will as much as possible towards the accomplishment of that relationship. On the other hand, this desire, thus it ought to be, has only called forth that other desire, what exists. The desiring of knowing what exists is already a consequence of the question, how is it possible? Why precisely so? Our wonder at the disagreement between our desires and the course of the world has led to our learning to know the course of the world. Perhaps the matter stands differently. Maybe the expression, thus it ought to be, is merely the utterance of our desire to overcome the world. 334. Today, when every attempt at determining how man should be is received with some irony, when we adhere to the notion that in spite of all, one only becomes what one is, in spite of all, that is to say, education, instruction, environment, accident, and disaster. In the matter of morality, we have learnt, in a very peculiar way, how to reverse the relation of cause and effect. Nothing perhaps distinguishes us more than this from the ancient believers in morality. We no longer say, for instance, vice is the cause of a man's physical ruin, and we no longer say, a man prospers with virtue because it brings a long life and happiness. Our minds today are much more inclined to the belief that vice and virtue are not causes but only effects. A man becomes a respectable member of society because he was a respectable man from the start. That is to say, because he was born in possession of good instincts and prosperous propensities. Should a man enter the world poor and the son of parents who are neither economical nor thrifty, he is unsusceptible of being improved. That is to say, he is only fit for the prison or the madhouse. Today we are no longer able to separate moral from physical degeneration. The former is merely a complicated symptom of the latter. A man is necessarily bad just as he is necessarily ill. Bad. This word here stands for a certain lack of capacity, which is related physiologically with the degenerating type, for instance, a weak will, an uncertain and many-sided personality, the inability to resist reacting to a stimulus and to control oneself, and a certain constraint resulting from every suggestion proceeding from another's will. Vice is not a cause, it is an effect. Vice is a somewhat arbitrary epitome of certain effects resulting from physiological degeneracy. A general proposition, such as that which Christianity teaches, namely, man is evil, would be justified provided one were justified in regarding a given type of degenerate man as normal. But this may be an exaggeration. Of course, wherever Christianity prospers and prevails, the proposition holds good, for then the existence of an unhealthy soil, of a degenerate territory, is demonstrated. 335. It is difficult to have sufficient respect for man when one sees how he understands the art of fighting his way, of enduring, of turning circumstances to his own advantage, and of overthrowing opponents. But when he is seen in the light of his desires, he is the most absurd of all animals. It is just as if he required a playground for his cowardice, his laziness, his feebleness, his sweetness, his submissiveness, where he recovers from his strong virile virtues. Just look at man's desiderata and his ideals. Man, when he desires, tries to recover from that which is eternally valuable in him, from his deeds, and then he rushes into nonentity, absurdity, valuelessness, childishness. The intellectual indigence and lack of inventive power of this resourceful and inventive animal is simply terrible. The ideal is at the same time the penalty man pays for the enormous expenditure which he has to defray in all real and pressing duties. Should reality cease to prevail, there follow dreams, fatigue, weakness. An ideal might even be regarded as a form of dream, fatigue, or weakness. The strongest and the most impotent men become alike when this condition overtakes them. They deify the cessation of work, of war, of passions, of suspense, of contrasts, of reality, in short, of the struggle for knowledge and of the trouble of acquiring it. Innocence to them is idealized stultification. Blessedness is idealized idleness. Love, the ideal state of the gregarious animal that will no longer have an enemy, and thus everything that lowers and belittles man is elevated to an ideal. 336. A desire magnifies the thing desired, and by not being realized, it grows. The greatest ideas are those which have been created by the strongest and longest desiring. Things grow ever more valuable in our estimation, the more our desire for them increases. If moral values have become the highest values, it simply shows that the moral ideal is the one which has been realized least, and thus it represented the beyond to all suffering, as a road to blessedness. Man, with ever-increasing ardor, has only been embracing clouds, and ultimately called his desperation and impotence God. 337. Think of the naivete of all ultimate desiderata when the wherefore of man remains unknown. 338. What is the counterfeit coinage of morality? First of all, we should know what good and evil mean. That is as good as wishing to know why man is here, and what his goal or destiny is. And that means that one would fain know that man actually has a goal or a destiny. 339. The very obscure and arbitrary notion that humanity has a general duty to perform, and that as a whole it is striving towards a goal, is still in its infancy. Perhaps we shall once more be rid of it before it becomes a fixed idea. But humanity does not constitute a whole. It is an indissoluble multiplicity of ascending and descending organisms. It knows no such thing as a state of youth followed by maturity and then age. But its strata lie confused and superimposed, and in a few thousand years there may be even younger types of men than we can point out today. Decadence, on the other hand, belongs to all periods of human history. Everywhere there is refuse and decaying matter. Such things are in themselves vital processes, for withering and decaying elements must be eliminated. Under the empire of Christian prejudice, this question was never put at all. The purpose of life seemed to lie in the salvation of the individual soul. The question whether humanity might last for a long or a short time was not considered. The best Christians longed for the end to come as soon as possible. Concerning the needs of the individual, there seemed to be no doubt whatsoever. The duty of every individual for the present was identical with what it would be in any sort of future for the man of the future. The value, the purpose, the limit of values was forever fixed, unconditioned, eternal, one with God. What deviated from this eternal type was impious, diabolic, criminal. The center of gravity of all values for each soul lay in that soul itself, salvation or damnation. The salvation of the immortal soul, the most extreme form of personalization. For each soul there was only one kind of perfection, only one ideal, only one road to salvation. The most extreme form of the principle of equal rights, associated with an optical magnification of individual importance to the point of megalomania. Nothing but insanely important souls, revolving round their own axes with unspeakable terror. Nobody believes in these assumed airs of importance any longer today, and we have sifted our wisdom through the sieve of contempt. Nevertheless, the optical habit survives, which would fain measure the value of man by his proximity to a certain ideal mall. At bottom, the personalization view is upheld as firmly as that of the equality of rights as regards the ideal. In short, people seem to think that they know what the ultimate desideratum is in regard to the ideal man. But this belief is merely the result of the exceedingly detrimental influence of the Christian ideal, as anybody can discover for himself every time he carefully examines the ideal type. In the first place, it is believed that the approach to a given type is desirable. Secondly, that this particular type is known. Thirdly, that every deviation from this type is a retrograde movement, a stemming of the spirit of progress, a loss of power and might in man. To dream of a state of affairs in which this perfect man will be in the majority. Our friends, the socialists, and even those gentlemen, the utilitarians, have not reached a higher level than this. In this way, an aim seems to have crept into the evolution of man. At any rate, the belief in a certain progress towards an ideal is the only shape in which an aim is conceived in the history of mankind today. In short, the coming of the kingdom of God has been placed in the future, and has been given an earthly, a human meaning. But on the whole, the faithful in the old ideal is still maintained. 340. The more concealed forms of the cult of Christian moral ideals, the insipid and cowardly notion, nature, invented by nature enthusiasts, without any knowledge whatsoever of the terrible, the implacable, and the cynical element, even the most beautiful aspects, is only a sort of attempt at reading the moral and Christian notion of humanity into nature. Rousseau's concept of nature, for instance, which took for granted that nature meant freedom, goodness, innocence, equity, justice, and idols, was nothing more at bottom than the cult of Christian morality. We should collect passages from the poets in order to see what they admired, in lofty mountains, for instance. What Goethe had to do with them, why he admired Spinoza. Absolute ignorance concerning the reasons of this cult. The insipid and cowardly concept man, a la Comte and Stuart Mill, is at times the subject of a cult. This is only the Christian moral ideal, again, under another name. Refer also to the freethinkers, Guyau, for example. The insipid and cowardly concept art, which is held to mean sympathy with all suffering and with everything botched and bungled. The same thing happens to history. See, for instance, theory. Again, it is the cult of the Christian moral ideal. And now, as to the whole socialistic ideal, it is nothing but a blockheaded misunderstanding of the Christian moral ideal. 341. The origin of the ideal. The examination of the soil out of which it grows. A. Starting out from those aesthetic mental states during which the world seems rounder, fuller, and more perfect, we have the pagan ideal with its dominating spirit of self-affirmation. People give of their abundance. The highest type, the classical ideal, regarded as an expression of the successful nature of all the more important instincts. In this classical ideal, we find the grand style as the highest style, an expression of the quote-unquote will to power itself. The instinct which is most feared dares to acknowledge itself. B. Starting out from the mental states in which the world seems emptier, paler, and thinner, when spiritualization and the absence of sensuality assume the rank of perfection, and when all that is brutal, animal, direct, and proximate is avoided, people calculate and select. The sage, the angel, priestliness equals virginity equals ignorance, are the physiological ideals of such idealists. The anemic ideal. Under certain circumstances, this anemic ideal may be the ideal of such natures as represent paganism. Thus Goethe sees his saint in Spinoza. C. Starting out from those mental states in which the world seems more absurd, more evil, poorer, and more deceptive, an ideal cannot even be imagined or desired in it. People deny and annihilate. The projection of the ideal into the sphere of the anti-natural, anti-actual, anti-logical. The state of him who judges thus the impoverishment of the world as a result of suffering. People take, they no longer bestow. The anti-natural ideal. The Christian ideal is a transitional form between the second and third, now inclining more towards the former type, and anon inclining towards the latter. The three ideals: A, either a strengthening of life, paganism, or B, an impoverishment of life, anemia, or C, a denial of life, antinaturalism. The state of beatitude in A is the feeling of extreme abundance. In B, it is reached by the most fastidious selectiveness. In C, it is the contempt and the destruction of life. 342. A. The consistent type understands that even evil must not be hated, must not be resisted, and that it is not allowable to make war against oneself, that it does not suffice merely to accept the pain which such behavior brings in its train, that one lives entirely in positive feelings, that one takes the side of one's opponents in word and deed, that by means of a superfoetation of peaceful, kindly, conciliatory, helpful, and loving states, one impoverishes the soil of the other states, that one is in need of unremitting practice. What is achieved thereby? The Buddhistic type or the perfect cow. This point of view is possible only where no moral fanaticism prevails. That is to say, when evil is not hated on its own account, but because it opens the road to conditions which are painful: unrest, work, care, complications, dependence. This is the Buddhistic point of view. There is no hatred of sin. The concept sin, in fact, is entirely lacking. B. The inconsistent type. War is waged against evil. There is a belief that war waged for goodness' sake does not involve the same moral results or affect character in the same way as war generally does, and owing to which tendencies it is detested as evil. As a matter of fact, a war of this sort, carried on against evil, is much more profoundly pernicious than any sort of personal hostility, and generally it is the person which reassumes, at least in fancy, the position of opponent, the devil, evil spirits, etc. The attitude of hostile observation and spying in regard to everything which may be bad in us, or hail from a bad source, culminates in a most tormented and most anxious state of mind. Thus, miracles, rewards, ecstasy, and transcendental solutions of the earth riddle now become desirable. The Christian type, or the perfect bigot. C. The Stoical type. Firmness, self-control, imperturbability, peace in the form of the rigidity of a will long active, profound quiet, the defensive state, the fortress, the mistrust of war, firmness of principles, the unity of knowledge and will, great self-respect, the type of the anchorite, the perfect blockhead. 343. An ideal which is striving to prevail or to assert itself endeavors to further its purpose, A, by laying claim to a spurious origin, B, by assuming a relationship between itself and the powerful ideals already existing, C, by means of the thrill produced by mystery, as though an unquestionable power were manifesting itself, D, by the slander of its opponent's ideals, E, by a lying teaching of the advantages which follow in its wake, for instance, happiness, spiritual peace, general peace, or even the assistance of a mighty God, etc. Contributions to the psychology of the idealists. Carlyle, Schiller, Michelet. Supposing all the means of defense and protection, by means of which an ideal survives, are discovered, is it thereby refuted? It has merely availed itself of the means of which everything lives and grows. They are all immoral. My view. All the forces and instincts which are the source of life are lying beneath the ban of morality. Morality is the life-denying instinct. Morality must be annihilated if life is to be emancipated. 344. To avoid knowing himself is the prudence of the idealist. The idealist, a creature who has reasons for remaining in the dark concerning himself, and who is also clever enough to remain in the dark concerning these reasons also. 345. The tendency of moral evolution. Everyone's desire is that there should be no other teaching and valuation of things than those by means of which he himself succeeds. Thus, the fundamental tendency of the weak and mediocre of all times has been to enfeeble the strong and to reduce them to the level of the weak. Their chief weapon in this process was the moral principle. The attitude of the strong towards the weak is branded as evil. The highest states of the strong become bad bywords. The struggle of the many against the strong, of the ordinary against the extraordinary, of the weak against the strong. The struggle of the many against the strong, of the ordinary against the extraordinary, of the weak against the strong, meets with one of its finest interruptions in the fact that the rare, the refined, the more exacting present themselves as the weak and repudiate the coarser weapons of power. 346. 1. The so-called pure instinct for knowledge of all philosophers is dictated to them by their moral truths, and is only seemingly independent. 2. The moral truths, thus shall things be done, are mere states of consciousness of an instinct which has grown tired. Thus and thus are things done by us. The ideal is supposed to re-establish and strengthen an instinct. It flatters man to feel he can obey when he is only an automaton. 347. Morality as a means of seduction. Nature is good, for a wise and good God is its cause, who therefore is responsible for the corruption of man. Tyrants and seducers and the ruling classes are responsible. They must be wiped out. This is Rousseau's logic, compared with Pascal's logic, which concludes by an appeal to original sin. Refer also to Luther's logic, which is similar. In both cases, a pretext is sought for the introduction of an insatiable lust of revenge as a moral and religious duty. The hatred directed against the ruling classes tries to sanctify itself. The, quote, sinfulness of Israel, end quote, is the basis of the priest's powerful position. Compare this with Paul's logic, which is similar. It is always under the cover of God's business that these reactions appear, under the cover of what is right, or of humanity, etc. In the case of Christ, the rejoicing of the people appears as the cause of his crucifixion. It was an anti-priestly movement from the beginning. Even in the anti-Semitic movement, we find the same trick. The opponent is overcome with moral condemnations, and those who attack him pose as retributive justice. 348. The incidents of the fight. The fighter tries to transform his opponent into the exact opposite of himself, imaginatively, of course. He tries to believe in himself to such an extent that he may have the courage necessary for the good cause, as if he were the good cause, as if reason, taste, and virtue were being assailed by his opponents. The belief of which he is most in need, as the strongest means of defense and attack, is the belief in himself, which, however, knows how to misinterpret itself as a belief in God. He never pictures the advantages and the uses of victory, but only understands victory for the sake of victory, for God's sake. Every small community or individual, finding itself involved in a struggle, strives to convince itself of this. Quote, good taste, good judgment, and virtue are ours. End quote. War urges people to this exaggerated self-esteem. 349. Whatever kind of eccentric ideal one may have, whether as a Christian or free spirit, an immoralist, or a German imperialist, one should try to avoid insisting upon its being the ideal, for by so doing it is deprived of all its privileged nature. One should have an ideal as a distinction. One should not propagate it, and thus level oneself down to the rest of mankind. How is it that in spite of this obvious fact, the majority of idealists indulge in propaganda for their ideal, just as if they had no right to it unless the majority acquiesced therein? For instance, all those plucky and insignificant girls behave in this way, who claim the right to study Latin and mathematics. What is it urges them to do this? I fear it is the instinct of the herd, and the terror of the herd. They fight for the emancipation of woman, because they are best able to achieve their own private little distinction by fighting for it under the cover of a charitable movement, under the banner bearing the device "for others." The cleverness of idealists consists in their persistently posing as the missionaries and representatives of an ideal. They thus beautify themselves in the eyes of those who still believe in disinterestedness and heroism. Whereas real heroism consists not in fighting under the banner of self-sacrifice, submission, and disinterestedness, but in not fighting at all. Quote, "I am thus, I will be thus, and you can go to the devil." End quote. 350. Every ideal assumes love, hate, reverence, and contempt. Either positive feeling is the primum mobile, or negative feeling is. Hatred and contempt are the primum mobile in all the ideals which proceed from resentment. Section B. A criticism of the good man, of the saint, etc. 351. The quote-unquote good man, or hemiplegia of virtue. In the opinion of every strong and natural man, love and hate, gratitude and revenge, goodness and anger, affirmative and negative action, belong to each other. A man is good on condition that he knows how to be evil. A man is evil because otherwise he would not know how to be good. Whence comes the morbidness and ideological unnaturalness which repudiates these compounds, which teaches a sort of one-sided efficiency as the highest of all things. Whence this hemiplegia of virtue, the invention of the good man. The object seems to be to make man amputate those instincts which enable him to be an enemy, to be harmful, to be angry, and to insist upon revenge. This unnaturalness, then, corresponds to that dualistic concept of a wholly good and of a wholly bad creature, God, spirit, man. In the first are found all the positive, in the second all the negative forces, intentions, and states. This method of valuing thus believes itself to be idealistic. It never doubts that in its concept of the good man it has found the highest desideratum. When aspiring to its zenith, it fancies a state in which all evil is wiped out, and in which only good creatures have actually remained over. It does not therefore regard the mutual dependence of the opposites good and evil as proved. On the contrary, the latter ought to vanish, and the former should remain. The first has a right to exist, the second ought not to be with us at all. What, as a matter of fact, is the reason of this desire? In all ages, and particularly in the Christian age, much labor has been spent in trying to reduce men to this one-sided activity. And even today, among those who have been deformed and weakened by the Church, people are not lacking who desire precisely the same thing which their humanization generally, or with their will of God, or with their salvation of the soul. The principal injunction behind all these things is that man should no longer do anything evil, that he should under no circumstances be harmful or desire harm. The way to arrive at this state of affairs is to amputate all hostile tendencies, to suppress all the instincts of resentment, and to establish spiritual peace as a chronic disease. This attitude of mind in which a certain type of man is bred starts out with this absurd hypothesis. Good and evil are postulated as realities which, in a state of mutual contradiction, not as complementary values which they are, people are advised to take the side of the good, and it is insisted upon that a good man resists and forswears evil until every trace of it is uprooted. But with this valuation, life is actually denied, for in all its instincts, life has both yea and nay. But far from understanding these facts, this valuation dreams rather of returning to the wholeness, oneness, and strengthfulness of life. It actually believes that a state of blessedness will be reached when the inner anarchy and state of unrest, which result from these opposed impulses, is brought to an end. It is possible that no more dangerous ideology, no greater mischief in the science of psychology has ever yet existed, as this will to good. The most repugnant type of man has been reared, the man who is not free, the bigot. It was taught that only in the form of a bigot could one tread the path which leads to God, and that only a bigot's life could be a godly life. And even here, life is still in the right. Life that knows not how to separate yea from nay, what is the good of declaring with all one's might that war is an evil, that one must harm no one, that one must not act negatively. One is still waging a war even in this. It is impossible to do otherwise. The good man who has renounced all evil, and who is afflicted according to his desire with the hemiplegia of virtue, does not therefore cease from waging war, or from making enemies, or from saying nay and doing nay. The Christian, for instance, hates quote-unquote sin. And what on earth is there which he does not call sin? It is precisely because of his belief in a moral antagonism between good and evil that the world for him has grown so full of hatefulness and things that must be combated eternally. The good man sees himself surrounded by evil, and thanks to the continual onslaughts of the latter, his eye grows more keen, and in the end discovers traces of evil in every one of his acts. And thus he ultimately arrives at the conclusion, which to him is quite logical, that nature is evil, that man is corrupted, and that being good is an act of grace. That is to say, it is impossible to man when he stands alone. In short, he denies life. He sees how good as the highest value condemns life, and thus his ideology concerning good and evil ought to strike him as refuted. But one cannot refute a disease. Therefore he is obliged to conceive another life. 352. Power, whether in the hands of a god or of a man, is always understood to consist in the ability to harm as well as to help. This is the case with the Arabs and with the Hebrews, in fact with all strong and well-constituted races. The dualistic separation of the two powers is fatal. In this way, morality becomes the poisoner of life. 353. A criticism of the good man. Honesty, dignity, dutifulness, justice, humanity, loyalty, uprightness, clean conscience. Is it really supposed that by means of these fine-sounding words, the qualities they stand for are approved and affirmed for their own sake? Or is it this, that qualities and states indifferent in themselves have merely been looked at in a light which lends them some value? Does the worth of these qualities lie in themselves, or in use and advantages to which they lead, or to which they seem to lead, to which they are expected to lead? I naturally do not wish to imply that there is any opposition between the ego and the altar in the judgment. The question is whether it is the results of these qualities, either in regard to him who possesses them, or in regard to environment, society, quote-unquote humanity, which lends them their value, or whether they have a value in themselves. In other words, is it utility which bids men condemn, combat, and deny the opposite qualities, duplicity, falseness, perversity, lack of self-confidence, inhumanity? Is the essence of such qualities condemned, or only their consequences? In other words, were it desirable that there should exist no men at all possessed of such qualities? In any case, this is believed. But here lies the error, the short-sightedness, the monocularity of narrow egoism. Expressed otherwise, would it be desirable to create circumstances in which the whole advantage would be on the side of the just, so that all of those with opposite natures and instincts would be discouraged and would slowly become extinct? At bottom, this is a question of taste and of aesthetics. Should we desire the most honorable types of men, that is to say, the greatest bores, alone to subsist? The rectangular, the virtuous, the upright, the good-natured, the straightforward, and the blockheads? If one can imagine the total suppression of the huge number constituting the others, even the just man himself ceases from having a right to exist. He is, in fact, no longer necessary, and in this way it is seen that coarse utility alone could have elevated such an insufferable virtue to a place of honor. Desirability may lie precisely on the other side. It might be better to create conditions in which the just man would be reduced to the humble position of a useful instrument, an ideal gregarious animal, or at best a herdsman. In short, conditions in which he would no longer stand in the highest sphere, which requires other qualities. 354. The good man as a tyrant. Mankind has always repeated the same error. It has always transformed a mere vital measure into the measure and standard of life. Instead of seeking the standard and the highest ascent of life, in the problem of growth and exhaustion, it takes the preservative measures of a very definite kind of life and uses them to exclude all the other kinds of life, and even to criticize life itself and to select from among its forms. That is to say, man ultimately forgets that measures are a means to an end, and gets to like them for themselves. They take the place of a goal in his mind, and even become the standard of goals to him. That is to say, a given species of man regards his means of existence as the only legitimate means, as the means which ought to be imposed upon all, as truth, goodness, perfection. The given species, in fact, begins to tyrannize. It is a form of faith, of instinct, when a certain species of man does not perceive that his kind has been conditioned, when he does not understand his relation to other species. At any rate, any species of men, a people or a race, seems to be doomed as soon as it becomes tolerant, grants equal rights, and no longer desires to be master. 355. All good people are weak. They are good because they are not strong enough to be evil, said the Latuka chieftain Komoro to Baker. Quote, disasters are not to be faint-hearted, end quote, is a Russian proverb. 356. Modest, industrious, benevolent, and temperate. Thus you would that men were, that good men were, but such men I can only conceive as slaves, the slaves of the future. 357. The metamorphoses of slavery, its disguise in the cloak of religion, its transfiguration through morality. 358. The ideal slave, the quote-unquote good man, he who cannot regard himself as a purpose and who cannot give himself any aim whatsoever, instinctively honors the morality of unselfishness. Everything urges him to this morality, his prudence, his experience, and his vanity, and even faith is a form of self-denial. Atavism. Delightful feeling to be able to obey unconditionally for once. Industry, modesty, benevolence, temperance are just so many obstacles in the way of sovereign sentiments, of great ingenuity, of a heroic purpose, of noble existence for oneself. It is not a question of going ahead. To that end, all that is required is to be at best a herdsman, that is to say, the prime need of the herd. It is rather a matter of getting along alone, of being able to be another. 359. We must realize all that has been accumulated as the result of the highest moral idealism, how almost all other values have crystallized round it. This shows that it has been desired for a very long time and with the strongest passions, and that it has not been yet attained. Otherwise it would have disappointed everybody. That is to say, it would have been followed by a more moderate valuation. The saint as the most powerful type of man. This ideal it is which has elevated the value of moral perfection so high. One would think that the whole of science had been engaged in proving that the moral man is the most powerful and most godly. The conquest of the senses and the passions, everything inspired terror. The unnatural seemed to the spectators to be supernatural and transcendental. 360. Francis of Assisi, amorous and popular, a poet who combats the order of rank among souls in favor of the lowest, the denial of spiritual hierarchy, quote, all alike before God, end quote. Popular ideals, the good man, the unselfish man, the saint, the sage, the just man, O Marcus Aurelius. 361. I have declared war against the anemic Christian ideal, together with what is closely related to it, not because I want to annihilate it, but only to put an end to its tyranny, and clear the way for other ideals and more robust ideals. The continuance of the Christian ideal belongs to the most desirable of desiderata, if only for the sake of ideals which wish to take their stand beside it and perhaps above it. They must have opponents, and strong ones too, in order to grow strong themselves. That is why we immoralists require the power of morality. Our instinct of self-preservation insists upon our opponents maintaining their strength. All it requires is to become master of them. This is the end of Part 9 of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.